Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Very happy to be here today. I will be your moderator. I'm Brice. I'm heading Transparency International's work on climate and environmental issues. And I'm very delighted to moderate this workshop, and we will try to make it as interactive as possible, or at least make sure we have time to exchange also with the audience and with the online audience. So please feel free to also to raise your hands even during the speeches of the panelists. If there is something like a clarification question or something you would like to add, we'll make that possible. So today, we focus on corruption as a key driver of climate change and environmental crime. And we would like to talk as concretely as possible about the links and the impacts on the rights of people, and come up with some concrete recommendations that could be used to strengthen anti-corruption frameworks. Including through a potential resolution at the next IACC COSP to be held in a year from now, maybe here or at least in the US. And I would like to start with thanking the organizers from the Wildlife Justice Commission and the IACC Coalition, and especially the Environmental Crime and Corruption Working Group. So there are actually sign-up sheets as well in the end of the room, so please leave your name here. Maybe actually a quick raise of a hand, because we wanted to have like some kind of focus on the IACC. So is everyone familiar with the IACC? If you can raise your hands, the one that feel familiar. Okay, so yeah, a majority, but not everyone. So hopefully we can say a bit on that as well. And who kind of feels a bit familiar with environmental crime? Is that... Okay, that's a large minority. And I think there has been quite a few sessions as well looking at environmental and climate issues. So we're also trying to make that link today. Just to introduce a bit the topic, but as you probably know and probably heard already, environmental crime produces enormous impact on the environment, threatening biodiversity, accelerating climate change, in short, destroying the planet. It's one of the most lucrative business at the moment, so yeah, hopefully not encouraging you to join that. But there is like an economic value. There are different figures floating around, but economic value can be up to almost 2 trillion US dollars. That's worldwide figures. So think about, in comparison, climate finance that we are all looking for, and developed countries not or missing the target of the 100 billion per year. That there is an interesting comparison there, or gap. And the proceeds of those environmental crimes became the largest source of income for transnational criminal organizations and non-state armed groups, which accounts now around almost 40% financing conflicts around the world. So in short, again, low risk, high return. Environmental crime hinders development, it increases poverty, threatens food supplies and land. It also produces significant health risks. In short, it kills, and especially the ones who try to defend the planet. And as we are trying to understand the role of illicit financial flows, there has been kind of some understanding or some building of understanding and action against drug trafficking, terrorism, but the connection between environmental crimes and illicit financial flows remain quite elusive for policymakers and also law enforcement officials. So this is why we have the session today, and we'll go through kind of 3 stages. First, setting the scene, then moving to hopefully to some solutions, and then getting a bit more specific about the IACC and some other anti-corruption frameworks. So without further ado, I would like to introduce my panelists, starting here on my left with Olivia Swaak-Goldman. She's the Executive Director of the Wildlife Justice Commission and the Chair of the NCAC Coalition Working Group on Environmental Crime and Corruption. She has more than a quarter century of experience in international justice and diplomacy, and she has published extensively on issues of international criminal law and international humanitarian law. And she served as a lecturer at both Harvard and Leiden universities. Then we will move to Professor Dr. Edgardo Buscaglia. He's a senior scholar in law and economics in the Columbia University and a professor in the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina and president of International Law and Economic Development Center. Edgardo is a public policy advisor to quite a few governments and non-governmental organizations and an author of numerous publications on organized crime and terrorism, as well as an international philanthropist focused on assisting victims of organized crime worldwide. Then moving to my right, or your left, Juhani Grossmann, who is the team leader of the Green Corruption Program at the Basel Institute for Governance. And Juhani leads the Basel Institute Green Corruption Program, which targets environmental degradation through anti-corruption, asset recovery, and governance approach. And he led before that, anti-corruption and good governance programs in Ukraine, Indonesia, and Philippines. And finally, my colleague, Joachim Stassart, who is a lead researcher on environmental crime at Transparency International Brazil. So over the past few years, Joachim has conducted research on the nexus between corruption and environment in different topics like land grabbing, deforestation, climate, wildlife trafficking, and illegal mining in Brazil. So without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to Olivia, and so starting by setting the scene and talking a bit about what are the links between corruption and environmental crime. Maybe you can use.
Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for taking the time after a great full week already to talk to us about this important issue. So just so we're all, and it sounds like everyone's really familiar with environmental crime, but just to be clear what we're talking about in terms of what we think of as environmental crime, it's the trafficking in terrestrial wildlife, marine wildlife, timber, waste, precious metals, as well as, for example, poaching, et cetera. So it's really broad, and that's so important because we want to address all of these issues that are helping to, to destroy our climate, but also the rest of our biodiversity. So it's important to keep it as a broad issue. Now, Brice was really insightful when he was talking about the impact of environmental crime. It's absolutely huge, and it's such a shame that it doesn't get the attention that it deserves, and that's why it's so important that we're focusing on it here, not only today, here in this room, but throughout this incredible conference. There's been I've noticed a big focus on the issue of environmental crime, and it's so important because it's one of the key issues that we should be focusing on. And whether it's in Canada at the CBD or if it's in Glasgow, all of these issues are really tied in together, and that's important. So it's great that we're focusing on it here. But in terms of wildlife crime in particular, we're at risk of losing 1 million species in the coming decade. Where the cost to local communities, the World Bank estimated, indeed up to $1 to $2 trillion a year. Impact on climate change, impact on disease, zoonotic diseases. So the impact is much bigger than what you would think of just in terms of the sort of specific issue. And it is absolutely serious organized crime, and there's become more and more evidence of organized crime getting involved in this issue. As the profits have gone up, more and more organized crime groups have gotten involved because it's very lucrative. And Dr. Buscaglia has a lot of great statistics on this, which are just fascinating to see the growth of it. But we've seen it also in our work at the Wildlife Justice Commission, where the criminal syndicates are getting much more sophisticated. In a way, that's a bad thing because it's harder to get them, but it means that the individuals that are less amenable, they're feeling a little bit more of the pain of going into this issue. So that's really important. Absolutely, one of the key drivers of environmental crime is corruption. I think everybody here understands that. Without corruption, you would not have wildlife crime, environmental crime more generally at the scale that we're seeing it. It's absolutely imperative. As someone said, it's the air that corruption is the air that environmental crime breathes. So we're not going to be able to stop the destruction of our biodiversity and our planet unless we address corruption, and that's for all of us just absolutely imperative to do it. And the role of corruption is really broad, so it depends on the crime itself and also the link in the supply chain. So for smugglers, it's really about customs officials, shipping agents, security agents at cargo and seaports. So those are the key individuals. Whereas in permitting and concessions, it's really sort of higher officials and politically exposed persons. So you need to be really creative in thinking about how you're going to be addressing this because it's really varied. I think I'll stop there for now. I'll listen to the rest of people speaking.
Thanks, Olivia, and thanks for unpacking a bit already what we mean by environmental crime. Moving to Professor Buscaglia, Edgardo, so the UN Convention Against Corruption, the UNCAC, is currently the only legally binding anti-corruption instrument that we have. But could you tell us maybe a bit about the difference between the UNCAC in the books, the theoretical of what the UNCAC should be and should achieve, and its implementation, especially in regard to environmental crimes?
Thank you very much. I'm extremely glad to be sitting next to Olivia. She's the person in charge of WJC, the Wildlife Justice Commission. And as you may know, the Wildlife Justice Commission is the only organization that I know that works with real case files, with real investigations, and not only provides information about all the patterns of wildlife trafficking, but also provides information of what is failing within the states, within each UN member state. And the teams that they lead are embedded within the prosecutor's office, within the police office. This is fantastic work. So I'm always glad to be next to you because some of our work that started in 1991 was based on gathering data on actual case files. So we go country by country by country with my teams, usually national teams. We cover 119 countries from all over the world. And we sample cases. We sample cases of organized crime. Some countries don't have organized crime within their codes legislated. So some countries use illicit association, like Argentina, for example, that doesn't have an organized crime law. Therefore, is not complying with the UN Convention Against Organized Crime. So, and we try to find out what is the gap between the convention in the books, that is, the legislation in each country that is complying or not complying with the UN Convention, and the convention in action, that is, the application of the laws. And as you can imagine, there's a huge, huge gap. We take samples of cases of organized crime where in 72% of the organized crime cases, we have public sector corruption or private sector corruption that is also covered by the UN Convention Against Corruption, as you know. And we cover 5 to 10% of the annual flows of organized crime cases and corruption cases in each country. I'm giving you from the top down where the data comes from. So all our data is not perceptional. They're not surveys of perceptions of corruption. This is actual information, real data that can be linked to cases. It's all published, by the way. The averages of our analysis are published, not the names of the parties, of course, but the averages of our work in each country. Now, let me give you some information. In 62% of the countries around the world comply with the UN Convention Against Corruption in the books. That is, they have the legislation, they have the institutional framework, only 62% in the books. But only 19% of the countries that we sample are complying with the UN Convention Against Corruption in action, in practice. So we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work ahead. Let me give you some examples. You don't have, just to answer your question, you don't have the institutional coordination needed, established by the UN Convention between intelligence agencies, The judiciary, sometimes the prosecutor's office and the judges are working at cross purposes. The police does not cooperate with the prosecutors. The judges don't have basic inputs in order to confiscate assets. So you don't have financial intelligence unit information within the sentence that is motivated by the judges. So 19% of the countries around the world only comply with the UN Convention. I don't want to put any country on the spot, but you can imagine that the countries from Northern Europe have a better performance than countries like Hungary or like countries like Argentina. However, Italy is doing very well with the articles of the convention addressing prevention, social prevention. So Italy has a great practice on socially preventing corruption, socially preventing organized crime. So Italy has a very good practice in terms of prevention and in terms of anti-mafia units, but they don't have a very good ability to bring in the private sector, enterprises, businesses, in order to engage in preventive activities within the 40 recommendations of the Financial Action Task Force that you may have heard about, the 40 recommendations of the task force to prevent money laundering, where businesses are supposed to go in. Now, 72% of the cases of organized crime involve corruption of authorities at some level. Could be at the low level, customs officers, could be at the mid-level, could be heads of agencies, or could be politicians. But what really worries me the most from our statistics, and these are based on case files, is that 93% of the cases involving political corruption, where you have actual reports of the financial intelligence units reporting on alleged corruption of politicians, are never investigated. Not even investigated. So this is a real gap. I'm not talking about sentencing, I'm not talking about indictments, not even investigated. So we need to find a catalyst, and later on we're going to be talking about proposals, so I'll leave that for the end, in order to engage international coordination and the real judicial processing of those political corruption cases that are not even being addressed by investigations. I see that all over the world. I even see it in the US, actually. So we can have cases that we examine in the US where you don't have any reactions when you have financial intelligence units reports. Now, wildlife and all the scope of crimes that Olivia was talking about, 27% of our case files have some degree of wildlife trafficking. Depending on the region, for example, in Latin America, you have much more illegal mining, illegal logging in Latin America, and then in Africa, of course, you have rhino horn trafficking, and you have ivory trafficking, and everything that WJC is covering through the analysis of case files and through the actual help that WJC is providing to states in order to enhance the judicial processing of those cases. Now, international coordination that is also established within this convention. Let's not forget that the UN conventions are legal instruments aimed at enhancing international coordination among judges, among prosecutors, among police, among financial intelligence agencies. So if internationally we're not coordinating, then the UN conventions are failing. Now, in only 17% of the organized crime case files and corruption files, we see actual international coordination at the judicial domain level. So we have a real gap in international coordination. So this is basically a descriptive picture, and I don't have much time, so I rather make sure that I stop here, and then later on we continue. Am I doing okay with the time?
Yeah, thank you very much. No, that was a lot of figures, but I think quite impressive to see the gap of implementation for the NCAC and also the 17% only of coordination, where we could think that starting by that would be maybe a bit easier. Turning to Juhani, so in the Basel Institute you have a program on green corruption, so maybe you could tell us a bit more about what does this mean and what does it entail, and what are, in your views, those links between corruption and environmental crimes?
Sure. Thank you, Brice. And so it's interesting because I was listening to Olivia talk about the sort of evolution of the Wildlife Justice Commission with an increasing focus on anti-corruption. So we're undergoing a similar journey, but in the opposite direction, if you will. We're an anti-corruption institution that provides case assistance around many countries through financial investigations and asset recovery. We look at prevention. We look at the role of the private sector. And one of the things that we see emerge repeatedly in our casework is the role of the environment in corruption, where in natural resources in particular, of course, are a recurring theme in all of the work that we engage in. And so about 3 years ago or so, we decided to see if there were sufficient similarities to warrant a separate program on this, which we then slightly provocatively called green corruption. And the program essentially looks at tackling environmental corruption from both an enforcement and a prevention angle. And I'm sorry, I have to correct the professor to say that Wildlife Justice Commission is not the only organization that works on casework. We do so as well, from a slightly different angle, but nonetheless. So we provide case assistance to environmental agencies, to prosecution services where there is specialized prosecution, specialized environmental prosecutors, and we also work with environmental agencies on minimizing their internal corruption risks, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later because it's a really massive field that is under-addressed. So on the enforcement side, as I mentioned before, our focus is financial investigations. We had a big panel on this. It seems to reemerge as a theme at this conference. And on the prevention side, we're applying essentially the tools that emerged out of the private sector, such as corruption risk assessments, implementing of mitigation measures, and the strengthening of internal controls. Thank you.
Thanks, Juhani, and yeah, maybe Edgardo wanted to say that maybe you guys were feeling a bit lonely, but yeah, I think there is also the Environmental Investigation Agency who is also trying to put some cases, and but yeah, I think there is just still only a few organizations doing this very important work, and we need more hands on deck for sure. Moving to you, Joachim. Can you tell us a bit more about the connections this time about environmental crime and climate, as we are trying to also make those links, as well as the impacts on people on the ground, on the communities, and especially, of course, in Brazil, where you're from.
Thank you, Brice. So yes, I think I'm going to talk a bit about the Brazilian context now, because I think it's a very sadly, a very interesting country to understand the impact of environmental crimes on the people and on the environment. So you said that environmental crime kills, and in Brazil it kills a lot. According to Global Witness, over the past decade, Brazil was the country that where there were the greatest number of killings of environmental defender. There were 342 killings of environmental defender, and with indigenous people and local communities that are particularly affected. And this is not even including all those who are surviving. I mean, we have a Brazilian whistleblower here that was evacuated from Brazil because of safety reasons. But it's not only about the human rights impacts of environmental crimes, it's also about its impact on climate and the environment. And I know I've been talking about that a few times here, but in Brazil it's a bit different than in other countries where greenhouse gas emissions are driven by the energy sector. In Brazil, greenhouse gas emissions are driven by land use change and forestry. We have, I think, in 2021, there was 46% of the greenhouse gas emissions that were coming from land use change. And this is pretty much deforestation and forest degradation, and illegality is at the heart of of deforestation. We have the data of an NGO in Brazil that has shown that 99% of deforestation is illegal. That means that pretty much all deforestation is the result of environmental crime. And what we have done at Transparency International Brazil is to look at a bit more at what are the corruption risks that make those environmental crimes possible. Because there was a general sense that corruption was tightly related to environmental crimes, but there was little knowledge about that. And we've been studying a few different sectors that are related to environmental crimes, such as the mining sector, logging sector, wildlife trafficking, land grabbing. And even though all sectors have their specificities, we have noticed that the corruption risks are actually quite similar across sectors. And I'd like to highlight 5 corruption risks that we have identified. So the first corruption risk that we have identified is the fraud in control systems of those sectors. So it can be wildlife breeding, it can be logging control system, it can be, when we talk about land grabbing, it can be fraud in land records. And the second corruption risk is the bribery of public officials, but also the collusion with private actors to consolidate those fraud in the cultural systems. The third corruption risk that we identified is the bribery and the collusion with law enforcement officers to turn a blind eye on environmental crime and basically just leave the impunity of the environmental abusers. The fourth crime that we have noticed that is permanent across sector is money laundering. And the fifth one was state capture and undue influence that leads to the deregulation of environmental norms and also the law enforcement of those norms. And just, I think it's a bit harder to understand this, and just to give an example of how absurd that can be, this year we were talking, the Congress in Brazil was talking about the legalization of mining in indigenous land, because so far it's not legal, but it's basically talking about the legalization of corruption related to illegal mining.
Thanks, Joachim. And yeah, good example of how through corruption make illegalities legal. Now moving hopefully to some of the solutions, or at least also and also illustrating again what we are talking about. But back to you, Olivia, if you can, yeah, maybe through kind of concrete examples, also show us what can be the response to maybe some of the corruption risks that Joachim was highlighting now.
Yeah, thank you so much. And this is what I think is also really interesting, is finding those specific examples of where it's happening, because that'll help us to be much more effective and focus our resources on those specific areas where we can really make a difference. We at the Wildlife Justice Commission just produced, prior to CITES, a report on rhino horn trafficking, 10 years, a threat assessment, what's gone well in the last 10 years and what's gone less well. This was based on 674 open source seizure data, but also 7 years of our own investigative work. So we're able to really ground truth the information. And we look at all the different aspects related to it. And one of the key aspects, we have a whole chapter on the corruption related to the trafficking of rhino horn. And one of the most shocking statistics that came out of this analysis is approximately 1/3 of all rhino horn that's smuggled is done so unconcealed. So that means that there's no concern about being found out. Their corruption has made them really bold in their trafficking. So that, and there we really kind of figure out the key areas where that's happening as well. So that's where we can focus our efforts. So while, for example, more than 50 countries were identified as being part of the supply chain of rhino horn trafficking, 6 countries dominated, either as source, transit, or destination. And we can find out even the specific airports or seaports where this is happening the most. So then we can really focus on putting the efforts there. But corruption is absolutely just one of the key issues, and this 1/3% unsmuggled or smuggled without being concealed just demonstrates that. We also were able to look at the vulnerable sectors in the seaports and airports, the customs officials, the freight forwarders, the security agencies. And one Malaysian trafficker who we were engaging with, he gave us intelligence on his tactics to clear shipments through Malaysian airports. And he openly discussed this with us, and he said that the customs clearance, the fee for customs clearance, the illegal fee, is between $1,000 and $1,500 US dollars per kilo of illegal shipment. And he factors that in to his business model and his fee. So it's really clear it's part of the business model. So we need to obviously change that. And the corruption also reaches higher level officials, again, as we talked about, depending on the space in the supply chain. So an example is a long-serving conservation official and a former policeman were arrested in Northwest Province in South Africa of October last year in the process of illegally transporting 17 rhino horns from a game farm in the Northern Cape. So there's just tremendous amount of corruption, but we can really focus on the specific issues and where the sort of weak links are, and then we can focus our attention there. And in order to do that, it's really important that we get more transparency in relation to the corruption and for countries to report more on their arrests of investigations and corruption. I know we've talked a lot about transparency over the last week and the importance, the role of opaqueness in facilitating this, but in the issue of wildlife crime as well. I think South Africa and China have done really good examples of reporting regularly on it, but we need all countries to report on it because otherwise we don't know what's going on in a way that we can be really effective. And finally, just to say that in this Rhino report, we also saw the global nature of this problem. We tend to think of environmental crime, or at least wildlife crime, as kind of the African-Asia nexus, but it happens everywhere in the world. Glass eels are trafficked in Europe, big cats in South America, bears in North America, fisheries crime, we all know, just it ends up in the supply chain. And waste trafficking often flows from the global north to the from the global north to the global south. So it's really a global issue. Funds generated from these crimes end up in the banks in New York and in London. So we need to be addressing it in a really comprehensive way. Maybe just to say, what can we do about it? Well, we need to be giving more mandates to law enforcement to be doing more parallel financial and corruption investigations. It's not enough to be leaving this to the wildlife or the environmental enforcement agencies that don't have those specialized skills. And obviously more cooperation. Professor Alia mentioned how little cooperation there is violating the UNCAC, but we need to do much more of that. So those are the main things I would leave it with for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. And yeah, thanks for also highlighting that corruption is everywhere, and it's not only in some countries and or in some part of the world. And I mean, we always say that corruption happens behind closed door, but I think it was also an interesting example to see that some of the corruption, or at least the environmental crime, we kind of all know, no? Everything is kind of known, and I think especially at the country level, I remember other cases where, for example, in Zambia, the mukula tree trade was involving, at the very high level, the wife of the president. So everyone knows about that, and of course, kind of close an eye. But and that needs to change if we want to see some result. Going back to you, Edgardo, and if you could also elaborate a bit, I mean, on maybe other links this time about the kind of crime convergence and what you've seen there, and the private and public sector corruption on that field.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. No, one of the great value-added aspects of coming to this conferences annually is that you're exposed to newer information, to new colleagues. So I thank you very much, my colleague, for bringing up their work. Thanks very much. Yeah, this is a big planet, and as I said before, as far as I'm concerned, with my limited information, the work of WJC has been, I've been following the impact of the work of WJC on the quality of work of judges, prosecutors in Vietnam, for example, where I was deeply involved with all of you. And you see institutional improvements in some of that work, and that excites me very much. So from now on, I will look forward to reading some of the work that you have so I can start engaging with your institution much more often. So thank you. Look, in our samples, in our annual samples of case files, we see that in 2008, for example, the average organized crime case was covering activities in 7 countries. That is, for example, the coca leaf grows in Bolivia, and then it's processed in Colombia, and then it's transported to Guatemala, and then it's sold in Mexico and the US, and then the money is laundered through 4 other countries, so basically 7 in 2008. The average organized crime case that we were analyzing, again, I limit my information to the samples that we take, the average organized crime case was involving criminal networks that on average were involved in 8 types of crimes: drug trafficking, arms trafficking, human trafficking, extortion, 8. Now, when you look at organized crime case files in 2020, that's the latest year that we published, we have 22 types of crimes for the average organized crime case that we're involved in, covering in each organized crime case an average of 15 countries. So here we go. This is the dark side of globalization effect. So here you have criminal organizations that are using the same infrastructure, the same human resources to engage in different types of crimes. They diversify risk. They diversify the criminal markets. They are engaged in economies of scope, we call it in economics. So they engage in a much more diverse, and wildlife trafficking, as I said before, nowadays is present in 27% of the case files that we're approaching. That's a lot. Now, the problem with wildlife crime is that usually when authorities are engaging a criminal network, they find drug trafficking, where the DEA has a huge budget, and they bring that budget to different countries and pressure. And you see some human trafficking, and prosecutors in Argentina or in Nigeria, they only focus on the drug trafficking effect. They only focus on maybe the human trafficking aspects on a second choice. But wildlife trafficking becomes a 3rd-rate, 4th-rate priority. So usually you see, like in Argentina, that illegal fishing is dealt through the administrative domain of the state, through administrative penalties, instead of being subject to the criminal justice system processing. So most of these ships, mostly from China nowadays, before they used to cover more South Korea, Spain, but most of them are subject to just administrative penalties. So the vessel is brought to port, and then they're subject to penalties, and then most of the crew, the captain, are free to go. So wildlife trafficking is not taken seriously in the cases that we're sampling. They're not being subject to the same kind, and that reflects law and economics. That reflects the budget priorities that prosecutors face. When you talk to a prosecutor, and I think we have a case at WJC where the prosecutor had clear wildlife trafficking, and it winds up focusing on drug trafficking. So that's one of the main problems when you find organized crime convergence. So you have the criminal network with 22 types of crimes, and the prosecutor, because of budget constraints, because of lack of pressure from civil society, because of lack of international coordination, it winds up focusing on drugs, on arms trafficking, and maybe, with good luck, on human trafficking. But wildlife trafficking stays behind. So this is one of the main concerns that we have with, in the case of illegal fishing in Argentina, Peru, Chile, and Ecuador is very concerning, because you have vast natural resources subject to the most extreme plundering in the past 10 years that is, in these countries, is basically subject to administrative penalties, and international coordination is lacking. Most of the ships that are engaged in illegal fishing in the South Atlantic, where I'm working with my team, we're embedded with the Coast Guard. So we are there when we see them. Sometimes these vessels are shooting back at the Coast Guard, and then they're taken to port, and what we see, and this is something very concerning, is that the Chinese government, for example, starts pressuring the Argentine government on not criminalizing the case, because if they do, they will be subject to a blockage of their financial loans from Chinese banks. So you have this kind of this is something that I've seen in this country. So the Chinese government engages in pressure in order to make sure that those cases are not subject to high-profile criminal processing, subject to financial pressures, because most of those countries are extremely hungry for loans from this Chinese bank. So we have a problem linked to the role of the states, too, in this problem. So we have to, most of my research lately has been based on state organized crime, state-sponsored corruption, like you see in the trafficking of gold from Venezuela, for example. So we can talk more about it. So I'd rather stop now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes.
I want to talk about something that nobody talks about, which is the pharma. Like in Brazil, there is an amount of herbs incredibly big in the Amazonia, and even there is a museum for this, and they steal it like crazy. So this is something that must be taught also.
About farmers, sorry, because there is the online audience as well. So the question was about
plants. Basically, the plants that there are like the knowledge of the plants and the curative of the plants that they are in the.
Sure. Yeah, maybe just rephrase your. Yeah.
So basically, there is a big traffic in Amazonia. The indigenous people have a lot of knowledge with the plants, and some plants we just have in Amazonia. I think in Pará. Yes, in Belém, there is even a museum that I went once with it was a botanical from Holland, I think, and he made a study. So there is a lot of like curative things in Amazonia, and these things are stolen from pharma companies all over the world, and the indigenous don't receive anything from it. So it's not only the animals, but it's like what's going on is it's bigger than this. And in Amazonia also, we have gold and minerals. So it's more than just people, but there's a huge bunch of stuff that's going on there. True. Thank you.
Thank you, and maybe maybe some of the panelists will come back to your question or your comment at least. Maybe turning to Juhani for the moment and talking about some of the tools again to address environmental corruption, and maybe you can say a bit about financial investigations, follow the money, or any other tools you would like to highlight as well.
Sure, thank you. I seem to become a big promoter of financial investigations at this conference, which is just as well, because there isn't enough of that going around as far as I'm concerned. So I think the first question is because we always sort of make the jump, right? We're talking about environmental corruption. The solution must be financial investigation, and one of the things that we try to do is not make too many assumptions in our program. So we have a whole stream of activities that focuses on trying to come up with new solutions, because I think one of the traps for those of us in the anti-corruption community is that we see everything related to environmental corruption as everything related to environmental degradation as corruption. So everything is caused by corruption, you know. So if we're a hammer, then everything we see must be a nail, sort of thing. So we try to be a little bit diligent about this and continue to assess whether the tools that we have in our anti-corruption arsenal are in fact fit for purpose in regards to addressing environmental corruption, how they need to be adjusted. And financial investigation certainly is such a tool. And it's a crucial tool for us because so far, at least, we haven't been able to find a better way to effectively sanction environmental corruption that has already taken place. It might be out there. I'm open to ideas, but so far it's the best one I've seen. And I see that some people were at yesterday's conversation, so I'll try to use a different metaphor today. But the one that I guess I would put is if we think, we always talk about corruption as a cancer, right? That's a common theme that I've heard at least. And to me, the sort of the follow the money approach, endorsing the follow the money approach is only as far as agreeing to go to the doctor if you feel something isn't quite right. That's great, but it doesn't get you very far yet, right? The financial institution, I think, is undergoing the necessary tests, and they can be a little bit unpleasant. They can be very difficult. They require lots of technical expertise. But then the real challenge comes, right? What do you do about it once you've followed the money, you've identified the trails? And so here again, there's different solutions, and thankfully, just like in cancer treatment, nowadays we have many ways to address corruption, including environmental corruption. And of course, some of these are more direct and crude and violent, even to some extent, like red-handed arrests and busts and all these things. And they definitely have their place, including and related to environmental corruption. The one that we have been most focused on, because that's what we know, so, hammer and nail idea holds, we have to be a little bit careful about this, is asset recovery. And so this is something that we've addressed quite a bit, and assess the possibilities of using asset recovery in relation to environmental crimes. And that goes a little bit after some of the comments that we've heard before, where governments undervalue the importance of environmental corruption. They treat it with administrative sanctions, and asset recovery, especially, for example, non-conviction-based forfeiture, where that's possible, are really valuable tools in an environment where criminal convictions are particularly difficult. We've seen some really good successes, and particularly in Latin America, with these tools. So if I can, torture the metaphor to the end, I would say asset recovery is like some of these new cancer drugs that are, like biomedicines, very, very complicated, very non-invasive, pretty low collateral damage, all things concerned, but also quite expensive to implement, but if they work right, and if you have the right cancer receptors that you're hitting, then there can be quite sustainable in terms of really taking the profit out of environmental criminals. Thank you.
Thanks, Juhani, and thanks for opening up the toolbox then, and broadening a bit, the different options that we have to tackle. Maybe turning now to Joachim again. And focusing again on how to kind of empower and protect whistleblowers, environmental defenders, and make sure civil society can play its role there, and maybe going into the direction of the question we got also from the participant from Brazil.
Can I answer to the question after?
Sure.
Because I think it's a different issue.
Okay.
And so about whistleblower and environmental defender, I think one of the biggest challenge currently is obviously violence and the impunity against related to those killings and the threat they're suffering. And I mentioned this figure of more than 300 killings of environmental defender over the last decade, but I didn't mention that there was an NGO that made the research, and that showed that there was only 14 of those cases that led to an effective trial. So it's less than 5% of the killings that are leading to real investigation of who are the responsible for the killing. But I'm not an environmental defender, so I was thinking of how I can bring this issue. And I want to tell a story of two environmental defenders that lost their life when they were protecting the environment and protecting indigenous rights, because I think it can illustrate also why good governance and integrity is essential to also to protect those environmental defenders. So the two environmental defenders I'm talking about is Bruno Pereira and Don Phillips, who lost their life in June 2022 when they were in an indigenous land at the border with Peru that is concentrating the highest number of isolated indigenous communities in the world. So Bruno Pereira was working in an NGO that was basically providing support to indigenous people with modern technology to report environmental crimes. And Don Phillips was an investigative journalist that was specialized on the Amazon rainforest. And they were murdered when they were so Bruno Pereira was helping Don Phillips to conduct an investigation on the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, and they were murdered when they were doing this investigation in this indigenous land that was, over the past few years, we have seen like a dramatic increase of environmental crimes and drug trafficking in this area. But they're a bit the tree that hide the forest, because there was a lot of pressure, international pressure and internal pressure, to investigate the case. So after a few days, the law enforcement officers started to investigate this case, and they found the alleged responsible for the murder. But what we still don't know is whether there's someone that ordered those murder, and whether this is connected to broader criminal organization and environmental crimes. But there are some suspicion that those people were involved with illegal fishing and wildlife trafficking in the region. So why do I mention this case? It's because I want to illustrate why good governance is very fundamental to protect those people. Because Bruno Pereira, before being part of an NGO, he was the head of the division of isolated indigenous people in the Federal Agency for Indigenous People. But he was fired from the agency when he conducted an operation against illegal miners in indigenous land in the north of Brazil. So it just illustrates the harassment that civil servants suffered from the government when they were actually conducting investigation against environmental crimes. And just an example of all the systematic effort that you had to dismantle the environmental governance in Brazil. And I mean, you can mention the political interference in the investigation against environmental crimes. You can mention the appointment of director at the head of the environmental agency that clearly showed a lack of integrity, and so on. And what were the consequences of that? Is this sense of impunity for environmental crimes. So you had a surge of environmental crimes, and it created this climate of violence in those regions. So I think it's important to, I mean, it was important to have this pressure to investigate those cases, but I think there are many other environmental defenders that don't have the same level of pressure. So it's important to as civil society, but also as the international community, to pressure for accountability for the violence against environmental defenders. And I think we are also at, speaking about the solution, we are also at a turning point in Brazil with the new government that has made a lot of commitments to reestablish the environment governance, and to even to create a ministry for indigenous people. And I think it's our role also to ask for, to put integrity, anti-corruption, transparency, participation at the heart of this new governance.
Thank you, Joachim. And yeah, hopefully it will be implemented at a higher rate than the UNCAC, as we heard before. And I think I mean, I don't know if you all can touch about that, but I was thinking when you were talking about, of course, the importance of having strong, independent institutions. I mean, you talk about the Environmental Protection Agency, and I think there was a similar situation here, even in the US, where those important institutions has been attacked. There are examples of anti-corruption commission as well, agencies who are also permanently under attack, and very good one, like in Indonesia, for example, KPK, as probably many of you know. But how can we make sure that those institutions are safeguarded from this interference over time? I think is maybe something you might have some ideas about. I mean, now for our last, like the third round, I would be a bit stricter with the time, so that we make sure we can also get questions from the audience. So I would ask all of you to kind of be as short as possible in your responses, and hopefully around 3 minutes would be perfect. And now, as I was saying before, so zooming in, I mean, we discussed already some kind of initial solutions, but if we could zoom in a bit about the anti-corruption frameworks, and especially the UNCAC. And maybe starting with you, Olivia, if you would have something to offer on that front, and how to leverage the UNCAC to develop strong action in response to those environmental and wildlife crimes.
Yeah, thank you. This is absolutely key. How do we have a really good legal framework already, as we heard? So there are two suggestions I could make at this point. One is enforcement. We've heard about this. Like, the lack of enforcement is scandalous, really. I mean, in terms of like the actual enforcement, even that we don't have, we're not doing better on the books, but absolutely, we need to get better on enforcement. And from our perspective, I'd say particularly Articles 49 and 50 of the UNCAC are really important. Article 49 on joint investigations, so establishing avenues of cooperation. These crimes are transnational. You need to be bridging the gaps between jurisdictions. If you're not doing that, you're just a step behind the criminal networks. It's as easy as that. So we need to be really focusing on how do we establish those mechanisms for cooperation, and that's required by the convention. So we need to get better at enforcement on that. The other article that I think is important is Article 50 in terms of special investigative techniques. That's the way you're going to target the high-level, high-impactful offenders, those at the top of the chain. They're not going to be in the room with the illegal product. They're going to be careful. You need to be able to do controlled deliveries, to do all the kinds of things that we do for other forms of organized crime. So we need to be really focused on addressing this as well. That's the first thing, is enforcement. The second thing would be a new UNCAC resolution. We think that could help if we had one on preventing and combating corruption as it relates to crime that impact the environment and climate. This could help recognize environmental crime as a serious organized crime. So it'll help develop the political will. It's so important that we get governments and parties to focus on this issue. And a resolution would help bring that to the fore. And we could ask about follow-up. So I think that a couple of issues that could be included in such a resolution could be a call on states to be transparent in relation to their implementation of the relevant provisions of the convention, including Articles 49 and 50, as well as the prevention that we heard about. Secondly, it could include matters related to making crimes that affect the environment serious crimes under the UNTAC, and also making sure it's a predicate offense for money laundering. So that's really important because it's not always there for all environmental crimes. And then third, to urge them to promote cooperation with environmental crimes and protection agencies, as well as those that are giving the licenses, the law enforcement, the forestry and mining, the sectors, bringing all these different agencies together. So those are the three things that could be considered in a special resolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. 2 minutes, 49 seconds, so thank you so much for being very quick. Edgardo, you have the challenge now. And maybe you can also elaborate a bit about, thank you for so many also concrete already recommendations, but the links maybe with the UN transnational organized crime, maybe elaborate a bit on that, and any maybe other UN bodies or conventions that you think would be useful to have more cooperation with.
Yeah, when we approach an organized crime case, we find that in 72% of the organized crime cases, you have corruption at some level. 72%. So you cannot address corruption without addressing organized crime. Political corruption is a criminal network always, and most of the corruption we see are part of networks. So the UN Convention Against Corruption and the UN Convention Against Organized Crime are two sides of the same coin. Now, we see only 17% of organized crime cases and corruption cases subject to international cooperation. I was honored to be invited last week by a group of more than 50 countries to a meeting in The Hague that for the first time, and this is not anymore a dream, they're discussing the establishment of an international court against corruption and organized crime. So this is something really important, because by establishing an international court, of course, it will not attract all the cases, but the shadow of that court will bring different incentives into those cases that are not being processed that we're talking about. So this special international court against corruption is, we were only 3 experts invited there, and I really hope that that moves along. This is led by the Netherlands, Canada, the US, and Ecuador. Ecuador is very much in the lead, and I hope that that is something that moves forward. These conventions have 4 dimensions. They have that judicial system effectiveness, and we're talking about police, prosecutors, judges, prison systems that are always the missing link, the prison systems, linked to financial intelligence units, customs, tax authorities. So we have like 14 institutions that are supposed to be cooperating that in most countries around the world are working at cross purposes. For example, prosecutors in Brazil or in Argentina do not have access to the public registries, to the property registries of the different states. So imagine that. So if I find out that a business is involved in trafficking many of these products from the Amazon, you're not able as a prosecutor to gather the data on what properties are in the hands of those businesses. So things so simple like that, the access to the property registries. So this is not quantum physics, so we need to improve that first dimension. The second one is prevention of corruption by the private sector. The implementation of the 40 recommendations of the Financial Action Task Force. Most countries are lying behind in that respect. Now, having an international court puts pressure. The 93% cases of political corruption that are not even investigated, I'm not talking, these are cases reported not only by investigative journalists, but also by financial intelligence units, are not even investigated. An international court would place pressure. Now, politicians would know that there is an additional channel where that case can land. So this is really important. Then the political corruption aspects. 3 minutes. Political corruption is key. I mean, you need to engage in political system reform. And finally, Italy, a country that I love very much, where I also live, is very much leading the world in terms of social prevention of organized crime. Most of the assets that are confiscated by the judiciary in Italy are reallocated to civil society networks. And this is key for the prevention aspects. So that's it.
Thank you, thank you. Almost there. So Juhani, the challenge now is on you. The list is already getting quite long, but is there anything from your side that you would add from what is needed in terms of policy changes, especially from the governments, to eradicate or reduce that corruption?
Sure. Thank you. And I'll pick up on the professor's theme of prevention, because I'm not only somebody who talks about financial investigations. So I think another facet of prevention that we haven't talked about yet, which is something that my colleague Becky Batts has been researching extensively under the TNRC project, is that environmental agencies lack effective internal controls in many of the countries that we operate in. And I'm not saying that lightly. They lack them to a shocking degree, frankly. If that's the case, why are we surprised that there's so much environmental corruption? Enforcement can only go so far. We're never going to be able to tackle so many cases. The professor mentioned very impressive statistics about how so much corruption isn't in fact investigated, never mind prosecuted. So we have to have a much more robust approach to prevention, and it has to be decentralized. There's really no other way around it. That's just not being prioritized, neither by these agencies nor by governments more broadly. So when we looked at the controls, so first we conducted corruption risk assessments. We found many corruption risks, and then Becky, in her brilliant way, sort of looked at it from the other side. What are the controls in place to control those risks? And there is very few controls, even on paper. And then when there were controls on paper, we would frequently go and talk to the agencies and say, right, so you have this integrity committee. What are you doing with it? And they would say, really? We have an integrity committee? Unless there is more focus on handling risks internally seriously, and providing the independence and the authority to the internal control teams in these agencies, we're going to continue seeing seepage of funds. We're going to continue to see corruption, and that's a particularly big concern, I think, as we see the climate crisis becoming more and more severe, and more funds being dedicated towards these issues, both to conservation, but also, of course, climate mitigation measures. And those funds are going to leak. They're going to disappear unless we strengthen the internal controls. So if there is one plea I can leave you with, is that to pressure your governments and the donors to issue those funds with conditionalities, that the internal controls in the agencies that are administering these funds are in fact strengthened severely. Thank you.
Thank you, Juhani. You managed the challenge as well. Now, last contribution from you, Joachim. If you could elaborate a bit this time about the role of anti-corruption institutions, how they can help, and especially also thinking of the framework of the NCAC and UNODC.
So let me know if I take too much time, but I try to. And it's very interesting to hear what the other panelists are saying, because we are actually working on both those issues of data sharing and internal controls with related to environmental crimes. And so how we did that, we worked with the National Strategy Against Corruption and Money Laundering in Brazil, which is basically a national forum that coordinates the action of all public institutions that are working on corruption issues. So this forum existed since 2001, and it's only in 2021, upon a recommendation of Transparency International Brazil, that they started to work on environmental crimes. So it was very interesting, because you had a working group that was established, and that you had, in the same working group, you had prosecutor, you had police forces, you had internal control bodies, you had courts of accounts, anti-money laundering agency, but also environmental agencies. So the working group was functioning for 2 years. The first year didn't have much success, because all the institutions were, they weren't very familiar with the topic. And so we kept working a second year with this working group, and we had some very good success. The first one I want to highlight is that there was a commitment to have that the anti-money laundering agency has access to the data of the environmental agency, which is, again, what the professor was saying. There wasn't any data sharing between those institutions. It was, I mean, it's key if you want to tackle environmental crimes. And the second success is that we had a commitment of the internal control bodies to mobilize their instruments to promote integrity, to conduct audits on environmental institutions. And do I have one more minute?
50 seconds.
So about the international mechanism, I think just to connect that with what I was talking with the National Strategy Against Corruption and Money Laundering, when those international bodies take position or resolution on environmental crimes, it's very important for us, because we can go to those agencies and say, oh, for example, FATF made environmental crime a priority, or NCAC has made a resolution on environmental crimes. And so it's much more powerful than just saying, it's important because we think that it's important. And it was fundamental to establish this working group. And the second, no, I stop here and we can keep talking.
Right.
I see it's 3 minutes.
Yes, yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. Yeah, just to make sure we have a few minutes, and thank you so much to the four of you already. And I would like to start. I mean, I had a couple of questions online, so I will start with those if that's okay, because yeah, I will just read them so that because they would have had the opportunity to do so if they would be in the room. The first one is about biodiversity and the impact of corruption on biodiversity. As you might know, there is the CBD COP15 in Montreal at the moment, and seeking to agree a post-2022 biodiversity framework. So the question is, what is the message to the CBD COP on corruption, and what should it be doing? So I think this is for all of you. And second question regarding whistleblowing from Scott Etchest, who is saying, just one international example, the report of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders and their anti-corruption work include a section on whistleblowers and recommendations to governments. What are your thoughts on taking the recommendations of the report forward? Is anyone willing to start on those two questions? So corruption, biodiversity, and whistleblowers. Joachim, do you want? Yeah.
I can talk a bit about whistleblowers. So it's a key issue now, and we have a project now to really work on the whistleblower channels as a way to protect environmental defenders. So we're trying to make this connection that environmental defenders are also anti-corruption whistleblowers. So we're trying to work on safe and accessible whistleblower channels, and there's also another connection between corruption and the impunity against whistleblowers, because corruption can also lead to the interference in the investigation against the violence that whistleblower can suffer. And I mean, there was this report of the UN Rapporteur on human rights and human rights defenders, and there was this consultation, and we looked at this issue to provide some example, but there's a lack of knowledge on this issue. I mean, we know that it exists, but we really need to understand how corruption is also perpetrating this impunity.
Thank you. Yeah.
Maybe I'll just touch on what's the message to the CBD COP. We really need to be looking at these issues in a holistic, systemic way. We cannot solve it if we're all staying in our silos, and that's why you know, with the UNCAC Coalition, we think the working group is so important, also to bring people together that are working on different issues related to this. So I would say to the CBD COP, make sure you're engaging with anti-corruption organizations, but also with UNODC, with specialists in this field. You can't rely, you know, not everybody's an expert in everything. And we have all this great knowledge. So bring those people into the tent, make it bigger, be more effective that way. So I would really just encourage them to break out of the silos, to reach out to those organizations that can help fight money laundering and corruption and all the other things that are keeping the devastation of our biodiversity going. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe just on the first question, what would be the message? I think one of the things we've been doing here quite actively, as you I think have all heard by now, is that there's this practitioners forum that's being set up, and of course TI is part of that practitioners forum as well, where we're trying to bring together experts on environmental corruption as and none or just corruption, vanilla corruption. And of course here we've been agitating mostly to the corruption experts to join, but there is clearly the need for more environmental organizations to join. So Wildlife Justice Commission, I think, is setting a wonderful example to address this issue openly, but that's not the standard, of course, in the conservation community yet. So just like we need to learn more about the environment, it would be great if they focused more on corruption so we can address the issue from both sides.
Thank you. Edgardo, do you want to?
Yeah, very fast. One of the main challenges we find around the world in these cases that we examine is that witness protection programs are very expensive. Most countries around the world don't have the capacity to engage in witness protection programs, and unless you have international coordination with rich countries, such as the Netherlands or the US, it's very hard to protect your witnesses. Another problem that we find is that you know, in order for members of criminal networks to collaborate with justice and are willing to provide evidence from inside, you need to have benefits given to those people. You cannot take them to court like Argentina does, because otherwise very few members of criminal networks within the state or outside the state are going to be willing to collaborate if you bring them to justice, if you bring them to court. So we need to engage in this debate. Of course, there's an ethical debate about how much of a benefit we should provide. But this is one of the main challenges I see. Now, the establishment of, and I keep pounding on this, the establishment of a specialized international court against corruption will bring a lot of resources into this coordination to protect witnesses that are key to enhance the flow of potential evidentiary material. I hope I'm clear. So this is really important towards the future, and I hope that next time we meet, I can learn about the progress made in that respect. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and the message has been already convened to Montreal, so thank you, all of you. Yes, there's one question here in the back of the room. Yeah, my colleague Rosa, thank you for...
Thank you very much. I come from a community where terrorism is being fueled by environmental crimes, and I was actually hoping to hear your experience regarding how, if it is part of the conversation when you're discussing environmental crimes. So I'm Nigerian, and mining at the moment, gold mining in my community, is actually fueling the buying of arms by terrorists. And all of that, of course, the background to that is already, these are communities that have been made vulnerable because of climate change, erosion, desertification, and a whole bunch of things going on. And I just wonder whether policies around the fight against terrorism are sort of taking all of that into account, because I didn't hear anything about that here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Is there any other immediate question, or we go back to the panel? Okay, let's maybe take that question. Sorry, yeah, there is another question, and just maybe to add also on the terrorism part, because we heard, I think, in the previous plenary that there has been some success, according to some of the speakers, on the fight against terrorism, and I'm wondering if we can learn from that on the environmental crime, or if there is also an opportunity, because the focus, as we just heard from you, has been on the drug trafficking, for example, and so how can we kind of shift that focus, maybe just to add to the question. But yeah, please.
Just one quick question. Talking about taking the money out of these crimes and taking it from a different perspective, considering the legislation that's already in place to protect against tainted supply chains, and as so many of the most valuable crimes in this space, timber and fish, actually end up in legitimate markets, how do we work with the private sector to dissuade them to take the motivating money out of these crimes? Thank you.
Thank you. Is there another question?
I have something that I...
Right. And we have 10 more minutes, so if there's any other questions, maybe raise your hand, and if not, we'll go back to the panel. Yeah.
More than a question it's if I lived as a whistleblower in Brazil, so basically my thing is like, how can international world create a kind of a coalition to kind of shield whoever does whistleblowing in Brazil. And the things in Brazil, from my experience, is like once it's exposed internationally, they stop. So they do under the table, but once it's exposed, they stop. So once you guys create a kind of a coalition, is already just creating this is already a way to stop some of the things in Brazil. And I want to know if it's possible.
Thank you. Who wants to start?
Maybe I can try to tackle the gold question at least a little bit. So I agree with you completely that this is an incredibly complex issue, and if there was ever any substance made for money laundering, unfortunately, it's gold. It's almost perfect in its qualities for that purpose. And so obviously there's many efforts to try and stem the flow of illicit gold. I don't know actually how many of you know that a huge percentage of gold is refined in the country I live in Switzerland, where we don't have any gold, right? And once gold is refined, there's really no way of knowing where it came from. And so that really is a huge challenge. There's obviously ways to address it in the consumer market, including through recycled gold and things like that. But I'm really very skeptical about those approaches to mitigate certainly the corruption elements of these of this substance. So I guess this is just a supportive statement to say, yes, definitely not enough is being done about it. And I think the tools we have right now are really insufficient in that regard. What they are, I think we all have to brainstorm a little bit more. In regards to the tainted supply chains, very good question. I suspect you might have been able to answer your own question, but thanks for the plug anyway. That the supply chains, of course, I think suffer in particular from the issue that there isn't the same level of corporate survival threat that we see in relation to corruption or terrorist crime or money laundering, right? Where the fines are existential threats to the institutions. Environmental fines are nowhere near that, even when they're high. And so I think that just reflects how much we value the environment as a society, unfortunately. Until those penalties are commensurate, I don't think we'll have similar times of behavior change inside corporate entities.
Thank you, Joachim. Joachim, do you want to?
Yeah, maybe I can answer the question about terrorism, but with a perspective from Latin America, and also the question that we had about biopiracy in Brazil as well. So I tried to show in my presentation that there was this surge of environmental crimes and that there was environmental agencies are not able to investigate those cases and so on. And I mean, I'm currently conducting an investigation, a research report on the relationship between wildlife trafficking and corruption. And I had this interview with an officer from IBAMA, the environmental agency, and he was just saying that wildlife trafficking, and including the trafficking of plants and of genetical diversity of Brazil, is just not a priority because it's only a few $100,000 when timber or land grabbing can be up to hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's just not a priority, and they don't have the resources to investigate that. And to connect that with the question about terrorism, we've seen that it seems that in Latin America, I think in Brazil, but also I've heard in other countries that you have this surge of environment crime that are very profitable, and the risk of getting caught is quite low. So you have all those other criminal networks that are seeing that as an opportunity. And we've seen the drug trafficking organizations that are getting more and more involved in environmental crime, including to using illegal logging and illegal mining to launder the money coming from drug trafficking. But a new area of research, I think there are some organizations that are working on that. And I think in the coming years, we will have more information on that, but it's very complicated. I mean, it's already very complicated to research environment crime, and to start to research the overlaps, it's also very complicated.
Okay, so we'll keep you accountable for the next IACC. Then you have 2 years.
Just very fast
Yes, please.
comment. Look, the question on terrorism from colleague there. There are 14 UN conventions addressing acts of terrorism. I don't use the term terrorism in general because you don't have a universal definition yet. Now, of the criminal networks that we have examined in our case files, 32% of the criminal networks in Latin America, 32% of the criminal networks that we have examined through our case files in Latin America engage in illegal mining, illegal logging, mainly gold, are engaged in acts of terrorism as a way to fund their activities. By acts of terrorism, again, there are 14 types of acts defined by the UN conventions, 14 UN conventions. You have acts of violence against the civilian population in order to force the states to do or not to do something. So this is very clearly established within the UN Convention. Now, the funding of those criminal networks in order to commit those acts of terrorism in Latin America is going up. So this is uncontrolled. So here you have an example of how going after wildlife trafficking and natural resource trafficking generally will reduce the capacity of these groups to engage in acts of terrorism like the ones you may have in mind, North Africa or even in Asia. So this is a very interesting area that needs more exploring. Thanks.
Thank you. Olivia, do you want to also give some responses?
Very briefly, and on the question of the private sector, because it's absolutely critical that we get the private sector involved. We cannot solve this on our own. And United for Wildlife, I don't know if maybe that's not a group that's well known in this crowd, but they've done a tremendous job in bringing in private sector companies to this area, both in the transport sector. So they have a lot of really big DHL, Maersk, a bunch of really big transport sectors, Emirates, I believe. And then also the financial sector. A lot of the, many banks are involved and FIUs. So bringing them in, showing them why it's important, helping them to realize and what they can do to start solving these problems as well. And just for a note of hope, I guess the recent EU legislation on forestry products in terms of like putting some of the burden back on private sectors as well, I think can help. So it's a combination of, with almost everything, it's a combination of stick and carrot, helping them to do it better and raising, as he said, the penalties for doing it poorly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have a few seconds left, so I won't try to summarize the conversations, but at least I learned a lot. So thank you very much to all the panelists. It seems, one of the recommendations, I think, is to make it a priority, environmental crime and tackling corruption there. So I think there is an effort to push for a resolution at the next UNCAC COSP. So I also call on all of you who are interested in continuing this conversation to join the UNCAC coalition working group on those issues and contribute to what kind of recommendations could be made and how this resolution could look like. So please leave your name at the end of the room, at the back of the room, and also Juhani mentioned this new practitioners forum that a few organizations have been launching during the conference. So please also join that forum if you're interested. I think there will probably be some information at the back of the room, or come to one of us here. Because many or a few people from the working group of the UNCAC coalition are here at the conference. There is a drink today from 6 p.m. onwards, so in an hour from now, and probably for a couple of hours. So please join also the working group members at the bar at the entrance of the hotel, the Marquee Bar. And thanks to all of you, and also people online who have been actively following and participating. Thank you very much. Good evening.